On the night of November 7, 2019, a man named Daniel Crow stood on a stranger's porch in rural Ashford, Connecticut, and whispered a dead child's name through a locked door. A child he had never met. A name that existed in no public record. A name that only one person on earth still said out loud, and only then, only ever, alone. By the time you understand how that was possible, you will never think about death or what survives it the same way again. Because what happened to Miriam Voss over the 6 months that followed that knock on her door suggests something that no cardiologist, no grief counselor, and no rational framework for the human mind has been able to explain away. Not fully. Not convincingly. And the harder you look at the details, the worse it gets. Miriam Voss was 39 years old when her husband, Thomas, died. This was April 14, 2019. A Sunday. The kind of pale, colorless Sunday in early spring where the sky looks like the underside of old ice and the air smells of thawed mud and last year's dead leaves. Thomas had been driving home from his brother's place in Simsbury, a route he'd taken dozens of times. A 2-lane road lined with bare oak trees that in summer formed a green tunnel but in April were just dark bones against the white sky. He hit a patch of black ice at 7:22 in the evening. The car crossed the center line, mounted the embankment, and rolled. He was declared brain-dead at Hartford Hospital at 11:55 that same night. Miriam sat in a waiting room that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial floor cleaner for 4 hours before a doctor sat down across from her and used the words "no meaningful recovery," and she understood, in the way you understand a sentence even before every word has landed, that Thomas was already gone. He was 41 years old. He had brown eyes and large hands and a habit of humming without realizing he was doing it. Old folk songs, half-remembered hymns, sometimes melodies Miriam couldn't place and he couldn't name. He smelled of cedar from the woodshop he kept in their garage, and of the specific brand of soap he'd used since college, and on cold evenings of wood smoke. He was the kind of man who remembered every birthday but forgot every anniversary and thought those two facts somehow canceled each other out. Miriam had loved him for 14 years. She consented to organ donation. It was what Thomas had wanted. It was on his license, it was something he'd said plainly, the way he said most things, without drama, over dinner, passing the salt. If something happens to me, they can have whatever works. So she signed the forms at 1 a.m. under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, a sound like trapped insects, and she held his hand for the last time in a room that smelled of antiseptic and plastic tubing, and then she drove home alone to the house in Ashford where every light she'd left on was still burning. Thomas's heart went to a 53-year-old man named Daniel Crow. Miriam didn't know this at the time. She wouldn't know his name for months. The donation registry maintained its standard confidentiality. She knew only that the heart had been successfully transplanted, that somewhere a man was alive who had not been expected to live, and she held on to that the way you hold on to any thin, weightless thing when everything heavier has been taken from you. Here is what you need to understand about Miriam before everything else. She was a private woman. Intensely, almost architecturally private. She had no social media presence. No Facebook, no Instagram, nothing searchable. The house in Ashford was set back from the road behind a treeline, accessed by a gravel drive that didn't appear correctly on most GPS maps. She had changed her phone number twice since the accident. Both times for reasons she described to her sister as just needing quiet. She did not attend her husband's company memorial. She did not speak to journalists. She communicated with the world on her own terms or not at all. And there was something else. Something she had told no living person. Not her sister, not her therapist, not the grief support group she attended twice in May before stopping. A thing she carried in the sealed room at the center of herself. They had lost a son, Elliot. 7 years earlier, he had lived for 9 days. She had never posted about him. Never written about him publicly. His birthday, September 3rd, existed in no document, no memorial page, no online obituary. His name was a word she said only in the dark, into the particular silence of a house where someone used to hum and now didn't. She kept a kitchen knife in the third drawer down on the left side of the kitchen island. Not with the other knives. Alone, in that drawer under a folded tea towel, blade facing left. She had put it there 6 weeks after Thomas died, and she didn't examine the reason too closely, and nobody knew. Nobody had ever been told. Nobody had ever seen her do it. On the night of November 7, 2019, 6 months and 23 days after Thomas Voss was declared brain-dead. Someone knocked on Miriam's front door at 9:47 in the evening. She looked through the peephole and saw a man she didn't recognize. Medium height, gray at his temples, a face that looked like it had recently been relearning something difficult. He was wearing a dark jacket and he was standing very still, and there was something about the way he stood, the weight of him, the particular angle of his shoulders, that made the fine hair on Miriam's arms rise before her brain had caught up with her body. She did not open the door. He leaned in close, and his voice came through the wood soft and certain, the way you speak when you are not asking but remembering. He said her nickname, the one Thomas had called her, the one that existed nowhere, not in any card, not in any text message she hadn't deleted, not in any world outside the specific private geography of her marriage. A name that had lived only in Thomas's mouth. And then he said Elliot's name. And then he said, I know which drawer you keep it in, Miri, and I need you to know that I'm not here to frighten you. Miriam Voss pressed her back against the wall beside her front door and slid down it until she was sitting on the cold tile floor, and she stayed there for a very long time without making a sound, because she understood, in the same way she had understood the doctor's sentence before it was finished, that whatever was standing on her porch was not entirely a stranger. She sat on that cold tile floor for 41 minutes. She knew because she watched the second hand of the clock on the hallway wall move, and she counted, and counting was the only thing that kept her breathing at a normal rhythm. The porcelain tile pressed up through her jeans and into the backs of her thighs, and she felt the chill of it climbing her spine, and she did not move, because moving meant deciding, and she was not ready to decide anything yet. She could hear him breathing on the other side of the door. That was the thing that undid her. Not the names, not the drawer, but the breathing. Slow and deep and slightly effortful, the way a man breathes when he has recently relearned how to do it correctly. She had heard breathing like that before, in a hospital room, through a monitor. The last sounds Thomas had made before the machine sounds took over and his sounds stopped. She pressed her palm flat against the base of the door, and the wood was cold, and she told herself she was not doing what she was doing, which was trying to feel whether he was still there. He was still there. At some point, she couldn't say when, she realized he had stopped talking. He wasn't asking her to open the door. He wasn't making demands. He was simply standing, waiting, with the patience of a man who had, perhaps, already waited a very long time in a much smaller and darker space, and had emerged from that space into a world that no longer quite fit him. She called her sister, Maya, at 10:23. She said, Someone is at my door. I don't know who he is. I need you to come. She didn't say anything else, because she didn't know how to say the other thing, the impossible thing, without sounding like a woman who had cracked cleanly down the middle from grief and isolation and 7 months of rural winter silence. Maya arrived in 34 minutes. She lived in Willimantic. She made it in 34 minutes, which meant she drove fast, which meant she had heard something in Miriam's voice that frightened her. By the time the headlights swept the gravel drive, the porch was empty. The man was gone. And Miriam, who had finally gotten up off the floor and was standing at the window with a glass of water she hadn't drunk, watched her sister walk up the porch steps, and watched her stop and bend down and pick something up. It was a photograph, face down, left in the exact center of the doormat, weighted at one corner by a small, smooth stone. The kind of stone you pick up from a riverbed without meaning to, just because it fits perfectly in the palm. Thomas had kept a jar of them on his workbench in the garage. He'd collected them for 20 years without ever being able to explain why. Miriam looked at the photograph for a long time before she could see it properly. It was Thomas, but not a photograph she had taken, not a photograph she had ever seen. He was standing in what looked like a garden, her backyard in summer, the hydrangeas in full blue bloom behind him, and he was turned slightly away from the camera, and he was laughing at something outside the frame, and the light on his face was the specific amber light of early evening in August, and he looked so entirely, casually, devastatingly alive that Miriam had to sit down again. There was nothing written on the back. No date. No name. Just a small thumbprint in the upper left corner, pressed there in what looked like wood stain, the dark, reddish-brown of cedar. Maya held her for a long time that night and didn't ask the question she was obviously forming, and eventually they both slept on the living room sofa with every light in the house burning, and the kitchen knife was still in the third drawer down on the left, and Miriam dreamed of Thomas humming a melody she couldn't place and he couldn't name, and in the dream she was not frightened, and in the dream she kept walking toward the sound. She found Daniel Crow's name 4 days later. She hadn't gone looking for it, or she had told herself she hadn't, which is a different thing. She had called the donor liaison at Hartford Hospital, and she had said she wanted to initiate contact with the recipient, that she was ready, that she had been told the option existed, and the liaison had said of course in a voice warm with practiced compassion, and a letter had been sent, and in the letter was a name. Daniel Crow, 53 years old, retired electrician, lived in New Milford, 47 miles from Ashford. No wife, no children. He had been on the transplant waiting list for 2 years and 9 months, and his condition at the time of the transplant had been described to her, in the careful language of medical documents, as unlikely to survive without intervention within 30 days. Thomas's heart had kept him alive. She held that fact up and looked at it from several angles, the way you hold a lens up to light. She did not write back immediately. She thought she would give herself time, let the information settle, decide what she wanted to say. But 2 days after the letter arrived, Daniel Crow knocked on her door again. This time it was 3 in the afternoon. Cold white daylight. She saw him through the peephole and felt the same thing she'd felt the first time. That precognitive alarm, the animal warning that arrives before any conscious thought has assembled itself. She stood there for a long moment and then she thought, he left a photograph. He left a stone. He came back in daylight. Whatever he is not trying to hide. She opened the door. He looked older than she'd expected from the single glimpse through the peephole in the dark. The gray at his temples was silvering further toward white. He had large hands. She noticed that first, before she could stop herself noticing. And they were hanging open at his sides, a posture of deliberate non-threat, the way you show a frightened animal that you are carrying nothing. He said, I know I have no right to be here, but there are things happening that I can't explain, and I think you're the only person who can tell me if I'm losing my mind or if something else is going on. His voice was low and careful and slightly hoarse, as if speech was still new to him in some way, as if his throat was still learning the shape of words. She should have closed the door. Every rational instinct she possessed told her to close the door. Instead she heard herself say, tell me one thing first. How did you know the drawer? He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were brown. She noticed that. She hadn't expected to notice that. He said, I woke up from surgery knowing where it was. I don't mean I dreamed it. I mean I woke up and I knew, the way you know which way is north, the way you know the floor is there before your feet touch it. I knew there was a kitchen, and I knew which drawer, and I knew there was a knife, and I knew a woman put it there because she was afraid of herself but not quite afraid enough to throw it away. The cold came up off the porch stones and moved around her ankles like water. She said, come inside. She would wonder later, for a very long time, whether that was the moment everything changed or whether everything had already changed and she was only just catching up to it. He sat at her kitchen table and he didn't look at the island, and she was grateful for that. She made tea because she needed to do something with her hands. The kettle was loud in the silence. Steam rose and vanished. He told her what had been happening since the surgery. She sat across from him and listened without interrupting, which took everything she had, because what he was describing, waking in the recovery ward knowing a child's name. Not a dream, not a hallucination. Knowledge present and complete, the way a song is present when you hum it without having chosen to hum it. Feeling, in the first weeks after the transplant, an almost gravitational pull toward a direction he couldn't identify, northwest of New Milford, a compass feeling that woke him at night and turned him in his sleep. Standing in his kitchen in August, 3 months post-surgery, and reaching into a cabinet for a mug, and finding his hand holding instead a bar of cedar soap, a brand he had never bought, had never in his life purchased, that had appeared in his cabinet with no explanation he could locate, still in its packaging, as if it had been there always. He had chalked it up to medication, to psychological disruption, to the documented strangeness of major surgery, the way anesthesia could hollow you out and fill you with someone else's sediment. And then he had started dreaming. He hadn't called them dreams, exactly. He said, Asterisk, it's more like a room I keep going back to. A workshop, with smell. A workbench with a jar of stones. And a man standing at the bench with his back to me. And every time I'm in that room, I can almost see his face, and every time I'm about to see it, I wake up. Asterisk. Miriam's tea was going cold in front of her. She couldn't move. He said, Asterisk, last week I woke up and I was standing in my kitchen and I had my phone in my hand and there were directions on the screen. To this address. I hadn't typed them. The phone was in my hand and the directions were there and I was already dressed. Asterisk. He stopped. He looked at the table. He said, Asterisk, I need you to know I understand how this sounds. I've been in therapy. I've talked to my cardiologist. I talked to a neurologist who specializes in post-transplant psychological presentations. They all have explanations. And the explanations all make sense. Asterisk, he looked up at her. But they don't know about the photographs. Miriam went very still. She said, What photographs? And he reached into the inside pocket of his dark jacket slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he knows the thing he is about to show you will change the shape of the room. And nothing could have prepared her for what she was looking at. Because it wasn't one photograph. It was a stack of them. 7, 8, 9 images printed on plain paper, slightly blurred at the edges the way photographs are when they come from a phone that belongs to a dead man. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were all of Elliot, a child who had lived for 9 days. A child whose image existed in no cloud backup, no digital archive, no phone that had survived intact. Miriam had 3 photographs of her son. 3. Kept in a physical envelope inside the cedar box on the highest shelf of her bedroom closet. The one she needed a step stool to reach, the one she had not opened in 4 years. She had never scanned them, never photographed them, never shown them to a single living person. She reached out with both hands and took the stack from Daniel Crow and she looked at every image, one by one, and they were Elliot, his face, his hands, the particular shape of his tiny sleeping mouth, and 2 of them she recognized from her envelope. And the last one she did not recognize at all. In the last photograph, Elliot was not sleeping. He was not in a hospital bassinet. He was in a garden, held in someone's arms in summer light, hydrangeas blew behind him. And he was looking directly at the camera with open eyes, clear and calm. The eyes of a child who is warm and unhurried and entirely present. And he was being held by a man whose face Miriam couldn't see. A large man, cedar-stained hands, turned slightly away from the frame. The humming started then. She heard it before she understood she was hearing it. Low, formless, rising through the floorboards or through the walls or from somewhere inside her own chest that she hadn't had access to in 7 months. She looked up from the photograph and Daniel Crow was sitting absolutely still across from her and his eyes were closed and his face had changed entirely and he was humming. An old melody, half remembered, something between a hymn and a folk song, and he wasn't doing it on purpose. His hand moved, slowly, without breaking the melody, without opening his eyes. His right hand moved across the kitchen table and stopped flat on the surface, and the cedar smell hit her so hard her vision went white at the edges, and he said, in a voice that was his voice and was not only his voice, I put the stone there so you'd know it was me. And Miriam Voss dropped the photographs. And in the silence that followed, the 3rd drawer on the left side of the kitchen island slid open. Slowly, smoothly on its own, and the folded tea towel shifted, and the blade caught the light. The drawer stayed open. Miriam did not move. She could not move. Every voluntary system in her body had simply stopped, the way a clock stops when someone removes the battery. Not broken, just suddenly completely still. She was aware of the cold air curling up from the tile. She was aware of the blade catching the afternoon light and throwing a thin silver line across the ceiling. She was aware of Daniel Crow sitting across the table with his eyes still closed and his hands still flat on the wood and the humming still moving through him like current through a wire. And she was aware, in a way that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to the oldest, deepest part of her, that the humming was Thomas's melody. The one she couldn't place. The one he couldn't name. The one that existed nowhere, in no hymnal, in no folk archive, in no recording she had ever found in 14 years of quiet, occasional searching. The melody that had simply belonged to him, the way his cedar smell belonged to him, the way his large hands belonged to him. Those hands. She looked at Daniel Crow's right hand lying flat on her kitchen table and she thought, I have seen those hands before. Not his hands. Not the hands of a 53-year-old retired electrician from New Milford with silver at his temples and surgical scarring beneath his shirt. But the shape of them, the particular weight of them in space. The way the fingers lay. Not curled, not tense, just resting, with the absolute unconscious confidence of a man who built things with his hands and trusted them completely. The humming stopped. In the silence that followed, she could hear the refrigerator's low electric murmur. She could hear the wind pressing against the kitchen window. She could hear her own blood, or thought she could, moving through the chambers of her chest. Daniel Crow opened his eyes. He looked at the open drawer. He looked at her. And whatever had been in his face a moment ago, whatever presence had been moving through him like a man walking through a house he knew by feel in total darkness, was receding now. She could watch it go, like watching tide pull back from shore. Slow, complete, and leaving the surface different than it found it. He said, in a voice that was his voice only now, scraped and exhausted, Did I do that? She said yes. He looked at his hand. He turned it over, palm up, and studied it the way you study a thing that has surprised you by belonging to you. He said, Asterisk, what did I say? At the end, asterisk, she told him. He closed his palm slowly into a fist, and then opened it again, and he said, Asterisk, I need you to know that I don't think I'm him. I don't believe that. I'm not. I'm Daniel. I know I'm Daniel. Asterisk, he said it carefully, like a man reciting facts to keep himself anchored. But there is something in here, and he pressed his fist against his sternum, against the scar she couldn't see but knew was there. Asterisk, that is not entirely mine. And I think it has been trying to reach you since April. And I think, asterisk, he stopped. He looked at the drawer. Asterisk, I think it needed you to know that it wasn't afraid. At the end, I think it needed you to know that the stone was from the jar. And I think, asterisk, he stopped again. His jaw worked silently. He said, Asterisk, I think it needed you to know about the knife. Specifically, I think that's why I'm here. Not the names. Not the photograph. The knife. Asterisk. The knife. Miriam looked at the third drawer. Open. The tea towel shifted. The blade lying there in its specific, private darkness. And she thought about the night she put it there. 6 weeks after Thomas died. A Thursday in late May. The house oppressively silent. The air inside stale and yellowish. The grief so physical it had felt like a change in atmospheric pressure. Like the whole world pressing in at once. She had stood in that kitchen at 2 a.m. and held that knife and thought thoughts she had never told her sister, her therapist, or any quiet room containing another human being. She had put the knife in the drawer because she needed it to be further away. Not gone, just further. And she had told no one, because to tell someone would have been to make it real. To confirm that she had stood there and thought those thoughts and needed the distance between herself and the blade measured in cabinet panels rather than miles. She said, and her voice was so level it frightened her, he knew. Daniel Crow said, yes. Asterisk, he knew, and he couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't get back to stop it. He couldn't call or knock or, asterisk. No, asterisk, so he waited. Until there was a way. Asterisk. Daniel Crow didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The answer was sitting between them on the table like a fourth presence. Solid and quiet and patient. Miriam got up. Her legs were unsteady, but they held. She walked to the kitchen island and she looked at the knife in the drawer for a very long time, at its specific weight, its particular blade, its 6 weeks of secret tenure in the dark below a folded tea towel. She picked it up. She felt its familiar cold handle. And then she crossed the kitchen and she opened the back door, and the November air came in gray and sharp and smelling of frozen ground and bare wood. And she walked to the trash can at the side of the house and she put the knife in it. She stood outside for a moment. The cold was immense. The light was going fast. That particular early winter collapse of afternoon into dark that happens in Connecticut like a door shutting. The tree lean at the back of the property was a black edge against a violet sky. And the air smelled, for just a moment, one moment only, So brief she would doubt it later without ever quite being able to dismiss it, of cedar soap, of wood smoke. She went back inside. Daniel Crow was still at the table. He looked wrung out. He looked like a man who had been carrying something a very long distance and had just been allowed to set it down. There was a fragility to him now, in the absence of whatever had been animating him moments before, that made him look his age and then some. She closed the back door. She went to the table. She sat down. They sat in silence for a while, the two of them, in the kitchen of a house where someone used to hum, and for once the silence was not the heavy, accumulative silence of absence. It was something different, something lighter. The silence of a room after a long conversation has ended. Not empty, but settled. She said, "He picked you." Daniel Crow looked at her. She said, "Asterisk out of everyone who needed a heart. He picked the one who would come and find me." Asterisk. She shook her head slowly, not in disbelief but in something adjacent to it, something closer to awe or grief, or the place where the two things meet. Asterisk. He always made decisions like that, quietly, without making a fuss about it, just arranged things. Asterisk. Daniel said, Asterisk. I'm sorry, for what you've been carrying. Both things. Asterisk. She knew he meant Thomas, and she knew he meant the knife, and she knew he meant Elliot. And she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to someone who knows your whole interior without having been invited into it, except thank you or I know or please stay for dinner, which is what she said. He stayed. She made dinner. Simple things, pasta, bread, the good olive oil Thomas had bought in bulk and she'd been slowly, guiltlessly using since April because it was there and it was his and it was small and continuous, a way of continuing. They ate at the same table and they talked about Thomas. Not about what had happened in the last hour, not about the photographs or the drawer or the cedar smell, but about Thomas himself. Who he was, what he was like, the way he hummed, the stones, the woodshop, the way he remembered every birthday but forgot every anniversary. She told Daniel about Elliot, about 9 days that she had been carrying alone for 7 years, 9 days that had been hers and Thomas's and no one else's, and it was strange and terrible and necessary to say them out loud to someone who already knew. Daniel listened. He was a good listener. He said the right things and didn't say the wrong ones, and she thought, Thomas would have liked him. And then she thought, Thomas does. He left at 9. He stood on the porch in the cold dark and she stood in the doorway and he said he would come back if she wanted. Not as a haunting, not as a visitation. Just as a person who had been given something extraordinary by someone he never met, and who wanted, if she'd allow it, to honor that. She said she'd think about it. Which meant yes, and they both knew it. She watched his car reverse down the gravel drive and its headlights sweep across the treeline and diminish and disappear. She stood in the doorway for a moment after. The night was very still. No wind. No sound from the road. Just the cold, and the dark, and the smell of frozen earth and pine resin and, faint as memory, cedar. She was not afraid. That was the thing she would return to, in the months that followed, in the quiet mornings, in the long rural evenings, in the therapy sessions she finally started attending again, in the conversations with Maya she should have had a year ago. She was not afraid. Not of the drawer opening. Not of the photographs. Not of Daniel Crow humming a dead man's melody in her kitchen with his eyes closed and his hand flat on the table. She had been afraid of so many things in the 7 months since April. But standing in that doorway on the night of November 7th with the cold coming up through her socked feet and the night pressing in from every side, she felt something that took her a long time to name correctly. She felt accompanied. She closed the front door. She turned off every light in the house except the lamp in the living room. The warm amber one Thomas had bought at an estate sale, and she'd always hated aesthetically and had never moved because she didn't have the heart. She sat on the sofa in its light. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't pick up her phone. She sat, and the house sat around her, and the silence was the settling kind, the end-of-the-day kind, the kind that has another person threaded through it even when you are alone. And after a while, she couldn't say how long, she heard it. Very faint, very brief, barely there at all. A melody, low, formless, somewhere between a hymn and a folk song, rising for just a moment from somewhere she couldn't locate, the walls, the floor, the middle of her own chest, and then gone. Here is what I want to leave you with. Daniel Crow and Miriam Voss stayed in contact. She has confirmed this. He drives up to Ashford occasionally. They have dinner. She's met his cardiologist. He's met Maya. The episodes, the humming, the automatic gestures, the moments of knowledge he shouldn't possess, have become less frequent as time has passed. Less frequent but not gone. The photographs have never been explained. The medical team involved in Daniel's transplant has reviewed his case and found nothing pathological. His psychological evaluations are normal. His memory function is excellent. He has no history of delusion, no prior connection to the Voss family, no plausible access to the information he arrived carrying. The stone is still on Miriam's windowsill in the kitchen. She didn't put it back in the jar. She kept it separate. She kept it where she can see it from the sink. The third drawer on the left side of the kitchen island is empty now. Miriam told her therapist about the knife in January. She calls that the hardest and most important sentence she ever finished. She still can't identify the melody. She still walks toward it when she hears it. And here is the thing that has stayed with every person who has encountered this case in any depth, the thing that cardiologists and grief researchers and philosophers of consciousness have circled without landing on. We do not know what the heart carries. We do not know what survives the brain's ending. We do not know what persists in the electrical pulse of a muscle that loved people, that raced with joy and contracted with sorrow and beat faster at the sound of a particular voice for 14 years. Science understands the mechanism. It does not understand the residue. Thomas Voss wanted them to have whatever worked. And it seems that what worked carried more than oxygen. Whatever that means. Whatever it costs you to sit with it. Whatever drawer you are keeping a knife in whatever dark. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.